Welcome to ThePrint Uninterrupted. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. Plamen Tonchev, who is the head of Asia Unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations at Athens. He's also the founding member of European think tank network on China, and he's been a member of the EU chapter of Council for Security Cooperation in Asia-Pacific Committee. Welcome to ThePrint Uninterrupted, Plamen. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Dr. Rao, for the invitation. Great pleasure indeed.
So here we are, in this picturesque ancient town of Olympia in Greece, and we are discussing the harsh realities of geopolitics. And what I learned from your very illustrious career is that you have been a China expert out and out, and you're going to Taiwan very soon, but we'll talk about that later. First of all, just give us a brief understanding of, kind of an overview of your illustrious career. I mean, what all have you been working on and what are you working on now? Because, it's very difficult for me to bring 30 years into this 1 minute. So why don't you do that?
Well, thanks very much for your kind words. I feel humbled by your, a slight exaggeration, I would say. But it is true that I've been working on Asia and China in particular for something like 30 years. I suppose I started working on China in the Balkans, Southeastern Europe. And I've written a number of publications, studies, surveys, on China's economic presence in Southeastern Europe, its soft power, its investment in particular, spots like the port of Piraeus in Greece.
Right.
But then my interests took me to other places as well, including South Asia.
And you're no stranger to India either.
No, I'm not. I dare say back in 2006, I published a book on India and Pakistan, which came out in Spain. It was published in Spanish, and I suppose people who are, who have a command of Spanish can find it and read it and hopefully enjoy it. But yes, I've written a lot about South Asia as well. And then I tell you, my research took me all the way to the Far East, East Asia, Southeast Asia. I've done a lot of work on EU-China relations as well.
Yeah.
And then I do take pride in the fact that I was one of the founding members of the European think tank network on China, known as ETNC.
Yes.
And I've been contributing annually to our reports. They are available on the etnc.info website. It's an interesting approach because back then in 2015, when we set up the network, we thought that we should look at European countries' approach to China, from a bottom-up perspective, instead of simply reflecting decisions made in Brussels and EU institutions.
Right. No, that's very interesting. So what I intend to do, because it's, you have done so much work and extensive work on China. So, what I thought of when I thought of this particular discussion with you, I thought, let's just trace China with respect to where the EU is standing today when it talks about de-risking from China, diversification from China. Where is it standing there? And then, of course, let me just then, with your help, understand better what is China doing in the Mediterranean. But we'll come to the Mediterranean part later, because here we are in the Mediterranean.
Right.
But first of all, what is the larger discourse in the EU on de-risking from China? Did it work?
I suggest we take a step back and go back to the previous decade. I would say that we may have to even think of 2008 and the global financial crisis, which was then followed by the Eurozone crisis, and Greece was a big part of it, I must say, back in 2010. So I suppose in the early 2010s, there was a lot of enthusiasm about China's, growing weight in the global economy. And there were great expectations that perhaps China could be a source of investment capital in Europe, including the Eurozone. And then, of course, a lot of countries were looking at China as a huge market in order to, absorb their exports. So these were the two key expectations back then. China was seen in a very positive light. At the same time, Chinese, mostly state-owned enterprises were investing in Europe. And Chinese investment in Europe peaked in 2016. And then there was suddenly, perhaps not that suddenly, a sense of apprehension that perhaps the Chinese companies are becoming a bit too aggressive, and perhaps we should, erect a protective wall against, these aggressive takeovers. So the second half of the 2010s was marked by a growing sense of, not panic, but certainly apprehension.
And unease, yes.
Unease for sure. And I believe that since the second half of the 2010s, shortly, that was right before the pandemic, European countries became more clear-eyed about the pros and cons of working with China. And then when the pandemic broke out in early 2020, it suddenly became quite obvious that, in fact, Europe was way too dependent on key supplies from China, starting from masks, all right, and personal protective equipment, and, of course, pharmaceuticals and all that. 2023, the European Commission came up with what became known as the de-risking strategy, which has not necessarily been embraced by all the European countries, but it is a point of reference, and it is very much talked about. And let me finish by saying that even the Americans started speaking about de-risking by borrowing pretty much the same term.
No, that's really interesting, Plamen, because, and the other thing that makes it so significant is that Ursula von der Leyen actually announced this strategy at MERICS, and you have had a long association with MERICS, of course, and we will talk about that as well. But you're right that it kind of became the catchphrase that decoupling is not possible, but de-risking is something that everybody should aspire for, because this is about building resilience of supply chains, etc. So where do you think European Union is standing today? I know that the member states have different perceptions, okay? But where is European Union on the whole, or the member states on the whole, are standing today when it comes to de-risking? Have they been able to de-risk at all from China?
I would say that there is no uniform approach.
Okay. How would you then articulate it?
I would say that if you look at the reports released by the European think tank network on China, ET&C, you'll see that there are 3 or 4 different groups of countries, depending on the way they approach China, whether they're really committed to risking or whether they're sort of, ambivalent. And there are countries, few, I would say, that clearly oppose de-risking. One country that clearly comes to mind is Hungary.
Yes. In fact, they only deepened their association with China.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. So I suppose that's the common denominator. There is no clear-cut, uniform, approach to de-risking.
Let's zoom in and focus a bit on the region of the world that we are in right now. And because this is also very important to Indian interest right now. You may have heard that India is trying to develop the IMEC corridor, and then the port of Piraeus happens to be that entry point. It's not etched in stone, and we are already looking at developing multiple gateways into Europe. But just talking about Greece and the port of Piraeus, you also mentioned in one of your, discussions that Piraeus and Budapest, China has been developing a line there, the railway line, but it has not really worked very well. Could you tell us a little bit more on that, and more on the performance of the BRI projects in Europe?
I would say that the Piraeus-Budapest railway track is strategically important from China's point of view. And it makes a lot of sense. Basically, the Chinese have always wanted to link up the 2 strands of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. The Maritime Silk Road leading to the port of Piraeus in Greece. And then the terrestrial, if you look at the map, the terrestrial strand, which goes through Kazakhstan, Russia, Poland, and so on, into Central Europe, including Budapest, Hungary's capital. It makes a lot of sense on the map. In reality, it hasn't been a success, certainly not a resounding success to date. And I don't want to bore the audience with figures, but I can tell you that so far, only 4% of the volume of containers or cargo, transshipped via Piraeus goes up to Budapest.
Okay.
Which is not a spectacular figure.
So what is the nature of Chinese dominance when it comes to the port of Piraeus?
Well, we must say that back then in 2016, when the Chinese company COSCO took over the overall management of the port, Greece was in a terrible shape at the height of the fiscal and, I would say, political crisis as well, which was one of the implications of the overall Eurozone crisis. Greece was pressured by its international creditors to sell assets, including state assets. And this is how the port of Piraeus ended up in the hands of a Chinese state-owned company, which happens to be a huge shipping giant, all right? And Piraeus is in many ways a unique case on a global scale. There is no other major port, container port, which is managed by a Chinese company to the same extent. I mean, Chinese companies do own or at least manage specific terminals, all right? But we're now talking about the entire port authority being in the hands of a Chinese state-owned company. This is unique.
So you mean to say that because we in India also track how the Chinese sort of dominate the port of Hamburg, which happens to be one of our most strategic gateways into, Europe. Yeah.
They do have a stake in one of the terminals, okay, not the entire port authority.
Right. But it's very different when it comes to Greece and Piraeus, where they have a...
Indeed, yeah. That's the difference. In Hamburg, they do hold a less than 25% of the stock of one terminal. In the case of Piraeus, they have 67% of the entire stock of the port authority, including the 3 terminals. You see, the scale is different.
Right. So that's interesting. And also, this is just one project, but how do you evaluate the performance of the Chinese BRI projects in Europe and also this Chinese 17+1 mechanism, which has not worked very well? And I ask you this question because I'm sure you heard my views on the fact that when India looks at what is happening in Central and East Europe, we find a situation where the Chinese 17+1 mechanism has not been able to sort of deliver. It has been a victim of overpromise and under-delivery. And therefore, from India's perspective, we see a strategic space where we can present ourselves as a reliable partner for trade. So that's the larger logic. But for that, we need a correct evaluation of how has these projects performed.
I'll simply borrow what you rightly pointed out as a key issue with the Chinese BRI. The gap between promises, pledges, and performance, or delivery, on the other hand. It is true that there's a huge gap, which, by the way, has brought about a lot of disenchantment and disappointment in Europe, particularly in South and Central Europe and Eastern Europe. The Chinese came along with a lot of pledges. The 17+1 format is a case in point, indeed. But I'm sure you know it, perhaps some of your audience will know it, that in fact, 17+1 has now come down to 40+1.
Yes.
Because 3 Baltic countries have walked out. And in fact, even those 14 countries that are still on board are not overjoyed. They're not enthusiastic about taking part in activities under this format. I think it's not falling apart, but it's certainly fizzling out, and it's lost a lot of its relevance.
So with that background now, Plamen, help me understand, what is China doing in the Mediterranean? Why did we have to discuss so much of China today?
The Mediterranean is important. Again, if one looks at the map, it's becoming immediately obvious that the Mediterranean is an important part of the world. Now, from Beijing's point of view, the Mediterranean ensures access to the European market. And this is important because Europe is the second largest trading partner of China after ASEAN. At the same time, the Mediterranean is a shortcut to the eastern coast of the United States, which is yet another big market for Chinese goods and services.
So would you just help the viewers also understand a little bit about the Panama Canal? I heard you talk about that, but then could you just elucidate it a little bit for the audiences as well?
This dispute over the Panama Canal, I'm not sure it's over yet.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that the BlackRock deal over the Panama Canal is definitive, because I understand that Beijing has a lot of objections to Hudson Port actually selling its assets to an American fund. And that, of course, has a political rationale behind it. But the truth is that since the Panama Canal may end up in American hands, the Chinese are not happy about it. And this is what makes the Mediterranean even more relevant and even more important in terms of, transshipping all these goods towards the east coast of the United States.
Right. So who is China banking on when it comes to the Mediterranean strategy? Is it Turkey? Because we know that China and Turkey have had a kind of convergence. And of course, I'm going to ask you about Russia, but then let's first talk about China and Turkey.
This is a very pertinent question, and thanks for raising it, because at our institute, we happen to be drafting a relevant report. Interestingly, the country in the Mediterranean, at least one of those littoral countries along Mediterranean shores that are really engaged and work closely with China, is not Turkey, it's Egypt, which clearly stands out. Turkey is one of the countries with a lot of Chinese investment, a lot of Chinese economic presence in strategically important sectors, like transport, energy, e-commerce. But I would say that Egypt clearly stands out, and not just because of that huge Suez Canal economic zone, which is populated, by Chinese companies. But interestingly, Egypt seems to be getting closer to China in military terms as well.
And I'm sure you're referring to the sale of the J-10C fighter jets that Egypt has recently finalized with China.
Well, I understand that there's been a lot of talk about it. I don't know to what extent, that deal has been finalized, but it is definitive. It's on record, and it's been officially announced that Egypt has bought Chinese missiles, for sure. And Chinese warships visit Egypt quite regularly, all right? And your audience should know that recently, last April and May, there were large-scale joint military drills, held by Chinese and Egyptian armed forces. This has not happened in any other country around the Mediterranean. And this is not just unique, but it's also a strong signal that Egypt is getting closer to China, perhaps for its own reasons. Perhaps Egypt, which has always been a strong ally of the United States, perhaps it has its own grievances. And I think that may relate to the conflict in Gaza as well.
Now, that's interesting that you sort of bring the focus on Egypt, because usually when we talk about Chinese interest in the Mediterranean, the obvious option that comes to our mind, and when I say our, I mean New Delhi's mind, is Turkey. Now, where do you think that Russia's interests with China converge when it comes to the Mediterranean? And I ask you this question in the background of what is happening in the larger Middle East, also in the Caucasus, with respect to Russia's influence waning completely in the Caucasus, and also, the fact that Russia was not able to support either Syria, Assad, or Iran recently in the 12-day war. So I asked you this question because we do see a kind of a convergence between Russia and China when it comes to Indo-Pacific. Of course, Europe is a completely different ballgame. I'm not even going there. But Indo-Pacific, we see it. What about the Mediterranean?
You rightly point out the fact that Russia and China, if you look at the grand scale of things, they have a strategic arrangement. I wouldn't call it an alliance.
Okay.
Both Moscow and Beijing refuse to speak about what the military alliance between the two.
They just call it a no-limits friendship.
Yes, no-limits friendship, which may have its bottom line, and this is, I'm quoting Beijing here. But in any case, it is a very close, arrangement, which, by the way, was enshrined in a joint statement, which was published in Beijing on the 4th of February 2022. 3 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. They do have a common enemy. There's no hiding it. They speak quite openly about it. It's
the United
States. but I would say it's the broader Western order. And I would say that the rules-based order, which both Beijing and Moscow call Western rules-based order. And they may have a point in this, but it's a fact that they've joined forces against the West in what I would call a marriage of convenience, because there are frictions between Moscow and Beijing on a series of issues. But what certainly takes precedence is let's join forces against the West, starting from the United States.
Okay. So how does this play out in the Mediterranean then?
Now, this is a very interesting point, because while you see a lot of convergence, in fact, something that makes you think of a military alliance with a lot of joint drills, in the Far East, in the Western Pacific, or in the Gulf. Here in the Mediterranean, there's only been one joint military exercise held by the Russian Navy and the Chinese Navy, and mind you, not in the Black Sea.
Okay.
It actually took place in 2015 in the Mediterranean, in international waters in the Mediterranean, which shows you that, in fact, Russians would not be happy with having Chinese warships in the Black Sea, and neither would Turkey be.
Okay.
So there's also a margin of, suspicion and, some sort of apprehension.
But the timing is interesting, because this is 2015, which is exactly a decade ago. And now we are in 2025, and Russia has been fighting this war for the last 4 years in Ukraine,
Right.
which it is unable to win militarily.
Indeed.
Okay. And the kind of convergence that we see between Russia and China post the war in Ukraine is something which is also rather unprecedented. So would you then argue that, compared to the situation of 2015, which is very interesting that they prefer to not touch the Black Sea, but actually go to the, free waters or the high seas of the Mediterranean, would you think that that situation has changed now, or do you think that the sensitivities are pretty much the same?
I would say that back then in 2015, of course, there was no war, but it was a year after China took over Crimea. This time around, 3.5 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is quite clear that China is helping Russia all the way. China provides a lifeline to Russia's economy. But it's not just China. Look at North Korea providing troops, fighting in the Kursk region. Look at Iran providing drones to Russia. It's quite safe to say that, in fact, Russia wouldn't have been able to, wage this war in Ukraine without help from China, North Korea, and Iran. And there's a very interesting outfit, these 4 countries basically forming a camp. What shall I say?
Yes, we call it.
All right, yes.
It's the CRINC, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
Right, indeed. It's a very interesting axis that one should keep in mind.
Okay, so bringing your attention very quickly to the region that is more relevant to us, which is Indo-Pacific, where do you see and how do you see the Russia-China alliance playing out here? Because that is something that we are really mindful of, I would say worried about.
I think that we should bring Taiwan into the equation. Speaking of the Far East, the Western Pacific, the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the map again, which always helps, Taiwan is part. I would say it's a crucial link in the so-called First Island chain. All right, which actually impedes China's access to the Western Pacific. All right. Now it's very interesting because all these joint military exercises, naval exercises, in the Western Pacific, with the participation of the Chinese Navy and the Russian Navy, of course, that targets the First Island chain. And all this talk about a possible, assault on Taiwan. The cross-cutting issue, of course, is breaking this chain so that China and Russia could have easy access to the Western Pacific. I think that this is the crux, of their strategy. Both Russia and China want to have uninhibited access to the Pacific, and this is their that's the weight, of their efforts, military and economic efforts. I would say that while they do work together in a lot of sectors, when it comes to their military strategies, that's really the focus. And this is what they want to achieve. Join forces, possibly together with North Korea, in order to break, that kind of a ring that they feel that they are encircled with by the United States and like-minded states like Japan and South Korea and Australia.
Yeah, fair point. But also that brings me to this interesting observation, Plamen, which is that where is Xi Jinping these days? You are going to Taiwan very soon, and I remember this wonderful conversation we were having last night about his health. So please tell us a little bit about where you think Xi Jinping is these days.
I do not want to replicate rumors because that's what we are talking about. And you know how secretive China can be about their leadership.
I think you know China better than me, so why don't you just tell us how secretive China can be?
Oh, terribly secretive. What's being discussed in circles to which I happen to belong, is that Xi Jinping has indeed been absent at least twice over the past year. The second time was recently. He literally disappeared for 2 weeks.
He didn't attend the BRICS summit at Brazil.
Now, there's a couple of theories on this issue. First of all, could it be health problems, which is quite likely? Could it be the fact that, if he attended the BRICS summit in Brazil, perhaps he would have faced, some inconvenient questions? And it's true that Brazil and some other BRICS members and countries from the global south are becoming increasingly vocal about being flooded, with Chinese goods. So they are sort of raising their tariffs and their protective walls against imports from China. So that would have been an embarrassment for the big supremo of China. There's also a rumor that he may be facing some domestic political trouble, which I think is the least likely of all the scenarios circulating these days.
And why do you think this is the least likely of all scenarios?
I think that he is strong enough, and he certainly has not lost his grip over the party, and it's the party that matters in China. But the health scenario seems to be a likelihood not to be dismissed.
Right. So in that situation, and if I'm just asking, just to hypothesize, do you think it sort of ramps up pressure on the Taiwan situation? Because ultimately we all understand that authoritarian leaders, wherever they may be, they want to leave behind a legacy. If at all this is about his health, then do you think that kind of, speeds up any decision in Taiwan?
That's a very good point. Because when Xi came to power in 2012, he immediately promoted the new narrative that is now, China's currency, the narrative about national rejuvenation. And Taiwan is a key part of that narrative. Just like Hong Kong and then Macau were absorbed, incorporated by the PRC, Taiwan is the next big step in the implementation, of this strategy. So I suppose Xi Jinping really would like to see Taiwan as part of China before the end of his third or fourth term, let's see. But he does want that to be part of his personal legacy. Now, history has its own, swings and turns, and we cannot really predict what's going to happen. But I do confirm what you're hinting at. Yes, I think that it would be his personal dream to see Taiwan as part of China before the end of, his leadership.
Right. And that brings me to the question on India, which is that you are no stranger to India, but in the current scheme of things, on diversification away from China, on all these connectivity projects that India is extremely ambitious about, and on the the security situation in the South Asian region per se. What are your thoughts, Plum?
You're asking me about India and to what extent it can play a part in the grand scale of things. I would say that India is becoming increasingly important. Fair enough. I would say perhaps a bit belatedly. Ideally, India would have joined the big league a bit earlier, and it certainly deserves a seat on the big table, the table of the great powers. I would frankly say that perhaps India is not there just yet, because while it is already the most populous nation on the face of Earth, while it certainly has impressive growth rates, rates that even the Chinese, would envy, I'm not sure that India has yet realized its huge potential. To give you an example, while it is the most populous nation, while it does produce a lot of goods and services, and it has a huge population and it has a huge market, its share in global trade is still rather limited, to put it mildly, not much more than 2%, which means that India still has a long way to go before it becomes, a great economic power. At the same time, India is already a big political power. It is increasingly a military power. So I suppose everybody is looking at India as the next big story in the next decade or so.
And how did you perceive the recent military standoff between India and Pakistan, which lasted about 88 hours and which pretty much sort of redefined the strategic posture we have in the region? Because for the longest time, this was, we saw the coming together of China and Pakistan, also aided by Turkey in a big way and supported by Azerbaijan from a different theater. So this was in many ways India's first two-front war. But this is what we talk about in India. What is your perception of it when you sit in Athens, when you sit in Brussels?
Well, a couple of points. First of all, I do not claim to know all the details of this clash. I'm sure that there have been heated debates in India, and your audience knows a lot more about this clash. But 2 points on my part.
Okay.
First of all, it was yet another response. I mean, the Sindoor operation was a response to yet another terrorist act. Okay. And secondly, I was really surprised to hear that what happened with the ceasefire was announced in a very different way by India, Pakistan, and the United States. While the American president went public on his favorite social network, right?
The Truth Social.
Truth Social, indeed, and said triumphantly that, okay, I've ensured a ceasefire between New Delhi and Islamabad. The Pakistanis confirmed it 5 minutes later. And when the Indian press conference, took place about an hour later, there was not a single reference to the American president.
Yeah, because India's position on it is different. It is that the Pakistani DGMO reached out. But anyway, I do understand that what makes it a bit of a spectacle in front of the rest of the world is that President Donald Trump has gone on record repeating it, millions of times by now. No matter where is he and what is he speaking on, he always makes a reference to the India-Pakistan situation, and then so be it. And my last question to you, Plamen, because it's been very, very enriching, this discussion. But my last question to you, do you think that the kind of politics that Donald Trump is perpetuating in the world, do you think that kind of opens up a better space, a newer space, a wider space for India-Europe cooperation?
I think we're definitely moving towards a multipolar world. Even before Trump came back to power. All right, that was a fact. That was a trend. That was a mega trend, I would call it. Now, Donald Trump may be precipitating developments with his personal style, and I'm being polite here. But regarding India, I think that India would rightly claim the status of a rising great power. And I think that would be really fair and justified. My only additional point would be that India may have to do its homework in order to claim that status rightfully. I mean, it would be great news for everybody if India did join the big league in order to ensure better balance between great powers. I do not want to see yet another G2 world, a repeat of the Cold War. No, I think it would be beneficial to everybody, the entire world, if India was part of that big league, because that would be an entirely new configuration.
Right. On that note, Plamen, thank you so much for taking the time out from a very busy schedule here at Olympia and speaking to us for the Print Uninterrupted. And I'm sure this was a very engaging debate, and we look forward to having you in India soon.
Thank you. A great pleasure indeed.
Thank you.